this book really came about for two reasons. One, I've spent so many years around foxes. I think it's 26 now. Started out with my own diary and then turned into a blog, and then I put my own experiences together in the form of this book. But I also felt that the fox is one of those creatures which does attract the attention of a lot of people, and is something that most people can recognise from quite a young age, and often are quite aware of sharing the landscape with us, but is not a species that most people know that well. And there's a lot more to them than the fact that they're quite fluffy and got a large tail. So I wanted to get some of the really good science that's out there and put it in the public domain in a way that was more accessible.
Welcome to Books and Ideas, where we talk with interesting people from a wide variety of fields, ranging from science to science fiction. I'm your host, Dr. Ginger Campbell, and I've been creating this podcast since 2006. You can find additional episodes of Books and Ideas at booksandideas.com, and you can send me email at docartemis@gmail.com. You can also submit voice feedback at speakpipe.com/docartemis and post to the Books and Ideas Facebook fan page. Don't forget, you can also get all the episodes of Books and Ideas by subscribing for free in your favorite podcasting app. My guest today is renowned British mammal ecologist Adele Brand, and we will be talking about her fascinating new book, The Hidden World of the Fox. Be sure to continue listening past the end of the interview, because I will close by highlighting the key ideas and sharing a few brief announcements. Well, I want to welcome you to my Books and Ideas podcast, and thank you for taking the time to talk with me today, Adele.
You're very welcome.
And basically, I would like to start out by asking you to just tell us a little bit about yourself, including, where you're from and how you happen to become a mammal ecologist.
I'm from Surrey, which is in southern England. I've always been interested in wildlife. I grew up in quite a rural area, and I was always very much aware of the fact that there was lots of wildlife around. I think foxes always sort of stood out for me because they have such strong personalities, and it was possible to get to know them as individuals. And also the ways that they interact with other animals are really interesting. And that sort of childhood interest sort of led me on to university, where I studied ecology as an undergraduate and then got a master's degree, similar vein. Yeah, so it's just been following the sort of career opportunities that have come from that, and always sort of kept going with the interest of foxes in my own backyard.
But you've also had the opportunity to go to many different places in the world, I got from your book.
Yes, absolutely. I've been privileged to take part in various research around the world. I've worked for a British-based conservation group which is responsible for studying animals in wildlife in many parts of the world. I went to Mexico, where I was collecting mammal data for them, and later to Romania and Croatia. It was really interesting there to have an opportunity to see species that I was familiar with from England, but in a more sort of wildwood type setting.
So when you're at home, what is your job?
I work in the conservation sector in England. I work with protected sites, and yes, I help to protect the wildlife over here.
So probably most of my listeners, I have a lot of UK listeners, but the listeners are predominantly American. So could you talk a little bit about how the woods and stuff are different in, say, England compared to America?
Yeah, it's well, to start off with, we have far fewer of them. England's obviously been industrialised for quite a long time and has a much higher human density than most of the US. So our woods tend to exist in quite small fragments. We have a very sort of mixed landscape. 70% of England is used for farming, and that's obviously partly arable and partly livestock. So our woods do tend to be small and quite fragmented and linked by hedgerows, sometimes just not linked at all. From an ecological perspective, there is quite a considerable overlap in species, and obviously foxes are found in both, and historically wolves and brown bears are species that we would have had as well. But yes, it's obviously the climate here is, although it does vary from north to south of Britain, there's much less of a range than in the United States, where you go from quite hot places like Texas, right the way through to places like Montana and North Dakota, which do have really severe winters.
Would you like to give us just like an overview of your book, The Hidden World of the Fox?
Yeah. Well, this book really came about for two reasons. One, I've spent so many years around foxes. I think it's 26 now. Started out with my own diary and then turned into a blog, and then I put my own experiences together in the form of this book. But I also felt that the fox is one of those creatures which does attract the attention of a lot of people, and is something that most people can recognize from quite a young age and often are quite aware of sharing the landscape with us, but is not a species that most people know that well. And there's a lot more to them than the fact that they're quite fluffy and got a large tail. So I wanted to get some of the really good science that's out there and put it in the public domain in a way that was more accessible.
Right, and you absolutely succeeded. I mean, I didn't really know very much about foxes. I have a friend who has red fox on her license tag, and I'm looking forward to giving her a copy of your book. But my own personal knowledge has been extremely limited, so I found your book really fascinating. I thought it would be fun to share it with my listeners. So let's start out by talking just a little bit about how foxes relate to some of our other familiar animals, in particular wolves and coyotes.
Okay, well, they're all part of the dog family, the Canidae, but foxes are in a separate branch of that in the Vulpes genus. So, yes, they are related to dogs and wolves and coyotes, but they're not that closely related and they can't interbreed. So, yeah, they have first split off from their larger relations.
And that was about 50 million years ago?
It was a long time ago, yes. And one of the things that I picked up on in the book is the fact that this whole family sort of originated in North America, and it's then spread across the rest of the world due to land bridges and the continent of North America sort of joining through various land bridges onto Eurasia and South America.
Yeah, it was kind of weird when you used the phrase in the book, the jungles of Texas. And I was thinking, it's actually kind of hard to imagine Texas as a jungle. So that just stuck with me. So the fox actually began in what is now North America, but migrated, I think you wrote about 7 million years ago. That number stuck in my head because I think that's around the time that our closest relatives, the chimpanzees, broke off from us. So it's kind of interesting how far back that goes from hominids. I mean, because humans are much younger. And then the red foxes that are living today, where did they come from?
Well, genetic analysis suggests that it seems to be what is now Iran, seems to have been the source of what we now know as the red fox. They have been detected in the fossils of Hungary in Eastern Europe about 3.4 million years ago. And yeah, they've just continued their spread. So it hasn't always been a continuous process. I mean, they've come into what is now Britain and then been driven back by the ice ages and then recolonized as the climate changed again.
So we really haven't been having a close relationship with foxes, not like we have with dogs.
Well, it's not got to the same degree as dogs. I mean, dogs are have incredibly close relationship with people, arguably more than any other species. But it is interesting when you start looking back at some of the archaeological data. I mean, there's a paper that was published from an archaeological dig in Spain recently from the Bronze Age, where they found that a human burial site, foxes have been buried alongside the people, and they did some analysis of the bones of these foxes, and they found that they had the same diet as the female humans in the camp, but not as the men. It's obviously hard to make inferences from that, but that could even mean that the ladies in the camp were feeding the foxes, or the foxes were perhaps kept as some kind of proto-pets. And again, in what is now Israel, there's been other burial sites where foxes have been buried alongside people. So it seems that prehistoric people were certainly very much aware of foxes, and they were an important part of the culture at the time.
So where do they live now?
These days, the red fox is one of the most widely distributed mammals in the world. I think it's 86 or 87 countries it's found in. So they're found pretty much across the entire northern hemisphere, across Canada and the United States, right the way through Europe, Russia to Japan, and really quite far south as well to India, Burma. They've introduced to Australia as well. And yeah, it's just the amazing adaptability of this species that's enabled it to live in such an almost unprecedented part of the globe.
So talk a little bit about what foxes are like physically.
Well, they can be a little bit deceptive, I suppose. It's almost when we see them, we sort of imagine them to be very dog-like. But when you start to they are different from dogs physically. Their bones are quite a lot lighter. They're really designed to leap on rodents. So everything about the fox, particularly the North American specimens, is sort of built with that sort of aspect in mind. So they've got quite small stomachs, unlike a dog. So their strategy is to eat little and often. Whereas a wolf in the wild might go for quite a long time without eating and then absolutely gorge itself, a fox will have to eat on a regular basis. They are much smaller, I think, than most people realise. 10 to 13 pounds is not an uncommon sort of weight.
Yeah, one of the things you wrote about that really surprised me was about how weak they are. You had the description of the fox trying to bite into the deer and that it really can't do that?
Yeah, I had 2 deer that were killed by a car driver on my road, and since they're already dead, I just sort of dragged one of their bodies off into the wood and put up a trail camera and sort of observed the behaviour of the foxes that came down. And yes, it was really interesting to see the struggles of these foxes when they were trying to get through the hide of this deer, and it's only a roe deer, which is a small species, is much smaller than the whitetails that you have in the United States. They couldn't get through. They just kept on and on tugging until the deer had disintegrated a bit more.
Could a fox attack a dog or cat?
No, they wouldn't go for a dog unless it's a very, very tiny breed like a Chihuahua, but it's almost unheard of. There's quite a lot of debate that goes on, particularly in the UK media, about the threat that foxes pose to cats. But again, the evidence that they actually pose a significant risk to cats is very low. Cats are actually physically much more powerful than a fox, even your average domestic cat. It's got claws that are retractile, they're very sharp, they're very dangerous, and they're much more muscular than a fox. Remember, the fox is an animal that's just designed to hunt rodents, so it's going to take the easiest prey it can go for. So a healthy adult cat is really much more than a match for a fox.
Yeah, I can remember once years ago I had a dog that accidentally caught a cat, and she regretted it.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah, so they mostly attack things that are much smaller than themselves.
They do indeed, and actually a large part of their diet is either insects or fruit. They're very keen on wild fruit, blackberries, cherries, hackberries. They also eat a lot of earthworms, particularly in this time of year, and they're also quite important for cubs. Voles are important and mice are important, but they will take easier prey if it's available as well.
And they'll scavenge on things that larger animals have killed.
Yes, they certainly do, and that seems to be a very important part of their diet in places where wolves still live. Obviously, we lost our wolves here in southern England about 800 years ago, but in parts of Europe where they're still found or where they've recolonised, they do hunt much larger animals like red deer, which are very similar to American elk, moose, wild boar, and foxes will very readily take advantage of that.
One of the things you describe in your book is the efforts of the various rescue organizations. If someone was to find a sick or injured fox, why is it so important that they take it to a reputable rescue organization as soon as possible?
There's a number of reasons for that. I think when people take in a wild animal, they're often very well intentioned, but their needs can be very different from those of a dog or a cat. And for some reason, a lot of people try to give wildlife milk, cow's milk, which many species actually can't digest. So it's much better that it's in the hands of someone who understands the species and can give it the medicine and food that's actually compatible with its system. There are other reasons as well, particularly if you've got a young cub, people who raise a cub that they find out in the wild. Again, they're often well-meaning, but if they're looking after that cub like it's a puppy, it's going to imprint upon them to some degree, and that's going to really compromise its ability to go and live in the wild as an adult. A reputable rescue centre will raise several cubs together, even if they're not related, and then they will sort of learn from each other what species they are. When they do go back into the wild, they can behave socially as they're expected to and have a much better chance of a normal life.
And that brings us back to the important idea about how different foxes are from dogs. And before we talk about that, talk a little bit more about the difference. I guess it may be obvious, but I think it's important to emphasize how different foxes are from wolves.
Yes, they are very different from wolves. I mean, wolves are the top predator in most of the ecosystems that they inhabit. So obviously they're physically much more powerful than a fox. But also their social behavior is very different. I mean, foxes do live in groups. That wasn't understood properly for quite a long time, but yes, they do live in social units. But they're very different from a wolf pack, whereas a family of wolves will hunt together, cooperate together, they howl together, they have a very tight bond, whereas with foxes it often seems like a bit of a love-hate relationship with each other. They will defend a common territory, and they tend to be more aggressive to foxes that don't belong to their own particular group, but nonetheless they don't display the kind of cooperative behavior that you see in dogs and wolves.
And wolves have to be cooperative because they're going to hunt stuff bigger than them. And I love the way you described in the book how if 3 or 4 foxes were chasing a rat, then 3 out of 4 of them would end up hungry.
Yes, and very upset, I should think. Whereas with wolves, obviously, if they're trying to bring down a bison, there's enough food for everyone.
And even so, this is something you didn't mention in the book, but that I've read a lot about other places, is that when people try to treat wolves as pets, that also doesn't turn out well.
No, it doesn't. It often turns out very badly, actually, because wolves have a much more powerful hunting instinct. I mean, a wild wolf, as we all know, doesn't really pose much of a risk to people most of the time. Their inclination is always to keep well away from us. I mean, I've been privileged to see wolves in the wild on quite a number of occasions, and yes, they certainly will stay far away from people. But when you put them in a sort of household situation and you've sort of taken away that gap, I've heard all kinds of stories that they can display predatory behavior towards people, which is obviously not great, but also they're very hard to tame, and sadly it often ends with the wolf or wolf-dog hybrid being put down. So again, wolves, like foxes, are animals to admire in the wild, I think.
What about the famous Russian foxes? I mean, you would get the impression from reading that story that it might be easy to turn a fox into a pet, but you argue strongly that that's not true. Would you address that?
The Russian foxes are rather different because they were deliberately bred over several generations to enhance their sort of compatibility with people. It is interesting from a biological perspective, this experiment that was done. I think from an ethical perspective, I do have some doubts about it, to be honest, because it is effectively selecting animals that some of them were just selected to be, quotes, friendly, others were selected to be fearful, and it's hard to justify creating animals that are obviously going to be stressed out for most of the time. Those foxes are kept as pets occasionally. It's not an aspect to which I've had a lot of dealings with, to be honest. My involvement's been much more with the wild foxes, and obviously the concern I have is people trying to pick up fox kits and trying to domesticate those, which definitely doesn't end very well.
Right, because that hasn't been the several generations of selective breeding thing.
No, you've just got an animal that's been born to species that have been sort of whittled by the wildwood for thousands of millennia, and yes, you're effectively taking that into your living room, and you're going to end up with an animal that doesn't really, is going to want to be back in the wild and is going to behave in ways that are going to be very difficult for you as well.
I'm going to jump in here for just a moment to remind you that you can help support Books and Ideas in 2 ways. You can support the show financially via Patreon. Patreon allows you to make a monthly pledge for whatever amount feels right to you. Your financial support helps offset the cost of producing the show, including my largest expense, which is audio editing. If you want to help out, just go to patreon.com/Books and Ideas. Of course, even if you can't afford to support Books and Ideas financially, you can help the show by sharing it with others, posting reviews, and sharing Books and Ideas via social media. Do foxes have a natural predator? I guess there would be more than one depending on what ecosystem they're in, but it's
an interesting question. The answer is sometimes, but not very often. The only species we have in Europe which predates them to any degree is the Eurasian lynx, which is quite a lot bigger than your North American lynx. Wolves don't really kill them. There was a great study done in Alaska it was out of Muri back in the 1930s, I think it was, who looked at this in great detail, and he found that foxes were not afraid of wolves, that the two species sort of were found in close proximity quite a lot, and that wolves were actually exploiting foxes. Not only did they dig up food which foxes had buried, but they also tended to take over fox dens and raise their own families in them. In North America, the coyote will displace foxes. It's bigger than the fox and clearly sees it as quite a rival. Though interestingly, that sort of situation has broken down a bit, where both species are found in some urban environments. But apart from that, they have some very significant natural competitors. Here in England, our species of badger is their main rival, and the dietary overlap between the two is quite considerable. Where badgers have declined, fox numbers do increase. But the exact mechanism of that's still not fully understood.
Right. And so just like there's sort of an inverse relationship between the numbers of, at least I know in North America, there's an inverse relationship between coyotes and wolves. When wolves are reintroduced, coyotes go down and vice versa. So foxes go up with the wolf population and down with coyotes normally in the wild.
That's correct, yes. And it is expected that as wolves recolonize their former range in Montana and elsewhere, that the fox population will increase as a result.
I was actually talking to one of my neighbors about this a few days ago. I live in a suburban area that has lots of deer, and I've seen, actually behind my house, 2 coyotes at the same time, which I think is kind of odd, twice. And my dog chased a single coyote, which fortunately he didn't catch. And I know that behind my house there are deer trails. In fact, I have just had the misadventure of trying to plant pansies. Apparently deer like pansies. So would I be likely to see a fox, or would the fact that I know that I've got coyotes mean that I probably won't see any foxes?
You're much less likely to see them if you've got coyotes hanging around. Where I've been watching foxes in Saskatchewan, it tends to be on the periphery of the national parks where the coyote activity tends to be less.
I think that one of my neighbors has seen one, but I've only got to see coyotes. I don't dislike coyotes, but I'd rather have the wolves back. I know they're not going to bother us. But I'm glad you mentioned the fact that the fox is not going to eat anybody's dogs or cats, because as you know, that's what people worry about.
Yeah. It is something which sometimes causes quite a lot of angst, where people they're worrying about something which isn't going to happen. I mean, obviously coyotes will kill cats, but foxes don't. They're just not built the same way. And yeah, that is a common complaint. But obviously smaller pets like rabbits and backyard chickens are much more vulnerable to foxes, and really prevention is the only answer in that kind of situation, and just building a solid run and keeping them indoors at night, and just being stitched in time saves 9, as they say.
Yeah. So foxes actually cache food. I didn't realize that they did that. I know there's kinds of birds that do that. So that's a common behavior for foxes?
It's an extremely common behaviour, yes. I mean, they will always take an opportunity to grab food if it's available, because obviously they don't know where their next meal is coming from. But because their stomachs are quite small, they can't eat that much in one go. So they will bury the surplus. They don't get it all back. In fact, this morning somebody sent me a trail camera clip from southern England where he filmed a fox walking through a clearing, and it was burying part of a rabbit that it was obviously unable to eat at that moment. And then a little bit later, a badger came along, dug up the cache and ate it. So the fox is obviously going to come back at some point and find that its meal's gone.
Is there any evidence that foxes will try to make sure that no one's watching when they bury their cache like some of the birds do?
Yes, there have been some really interesting observations about that in Canada, actually. The one scientist up there actually watched a fox burying some food and then scuffing snow over its own tracks as it backed away from the cache site, to sort of in the sort of probably vain hope that no magpies or crows would come down and steal the cache. The fox in the clip that I saw this morning wasn't looking around, but I could tell from its body language its tail was really curled. It was obviously nervous. It looked a bit like a dog that had stolen something and was expecting to be caught any moment.
So do foxes play?
They are incredibly playful, and they keep being playful all their lives. It's partly a fact of how intelligent they are because, they're still learning, still playful. And they will readily use anything that they find in the environment, whether it's natural things like sticks or things that people have left there as a toy. There's some wonderful clips on the internet of foxes playing on trampolines in people's back gardens. I've had shoes, dog toys, dog lead taken. There was one fox in my village that walked off with 5 Wellington boots, actually. I got one on a trail camera once that was walking off with a toy dinosaur. Anything they can pick up, they will make use of.
So how do foxes communicate?
Well, they have a wide range of calls. Certainly most people in England will have heard a fox's scream, even if they didn't manage to recognize it as such. And it is really piercing. It just sounds like a really angry cat, but it's often quite misunderstood, and people think that the foxes are killing each other when it's actually quite bloodless, and it's just their way of expressing their dislike at finding a rival in their territory. But they have many other calls as well. They have a much more sort of horse-like, dog-like bark, which they use during the breeding season. But their body language is very expressive as well. I mean, like dogs, they will use their tails to communicate and their ears. They will yawn if they're quite stressed. And they will put their brush up if they're feeling quite playful.
What about scents?
Yeah, fox urine is actually one of the few animal scents that people can detect. It's very powerful. And yes, they will, particularly at the time of year we're getting into now in England, we've got to the time when male foxes are wandering around marking their territory, and they do that the same way as dogs. They will cock their leg on vantage points. But they also use urine and their scat as what seems to be some kind of marking system for themselves. So if they have buried some food in a cache, when they come back and dig it up, they will often urinate or defecate on that point, and that seems to be almost like a notebook system to sort of let themselves know that cache is now empty.
So is the smell of the urine temperature dependent?
Yeah, there was a wonderful story I came across from the United States about some university campus who had a problem with people stealing their trees as Christmas trees, and they sprayed all these trees in the sort of cold northern winter with fox urine, because people cut down the tree, take it to their living room, and then of course it heats up and they got a problem.
Yeah, and I understand there's a product sold in the UK to neutralize this smell.
Yeah, that's not so much because it smells. It's more to deter foxes from marking in that particular area.
I'm pretty sure I've never smelled this smell, given how bad it sounded like from your book that it would be. In the pet store, there's a product for getting the smell of skunk out of your dog. So I guess maybe skunks are more common here.
Yeah, it is vaguely like skunk, but it's not quite as pungent. It's kind of sweet and musty, but it's not that kind of overpowering smell you get from a skunk.
Yeah, nothing like trying to describe the smell of something to somebody else.
I mean, having said that, I did have the experience, which I included in the book, of having a fox that decided to urinate on my shoes because it'd been playing with them. And I didn't realize this until I was in at work one day. And then walking around an office with very strongly smelling shoes. And yeah, that wasn't a good day.
Yeah, that was a funny story. So if not while it was going on, I'm sure. So I don't really know very much about mammal ecology beyond the fact that, like I said, I know that when wolves are reintroduced, coyote populations go down. But I would assume that it's really important to have accurate population estimates. So would you talk a little bit about how you figure out how many foxes are living in a given area? After all, they're not going to complete the census.
No, indeed not. They're not very easy mammals to count. In fact, most mammals are actually quite difficult to count. There has been a formula that someone has worked out, that the number of average scats that a fox produces per day. So if you walk a transect, which I did actually in one of my local reserves, and count the number of scats.
What's a transect?
A transect is a line which you will walk as a scientist. So basically, that might be 200, 300 meters long. And you walk down there and you'll look either side of that line, and that's sort of your sample, if you like, of the habitat. And the idea is that you go through initially and remove all of the scats that you find, then you come back sometime later and count all the fresh ones. And from that, theoretically, you can work out the population. I think it was an average of 8 scats per day.
Is it more important to be able to know how many reproducing individuals there are?
Yes, den counts can be really useful. There's a lot of foxes in the population that don't breed. So in each family group, you'll have a breeding pair. You'll probably have other adults who might be young from a previous year, but sometimes they just seem to sort of turn up and join the group. And then you will also have the cubs of this year as well. Many cubs will not survive their first year. So yes, you have this sort of family structure, and that is the basic fox landscape. Then on top of that, there's quite a number of foxes that are just nomadic, and they don't have a territory or a mate, and they will just rove around looking for a space in the landscape.
That must make counting them even harder.
It's very hard, and then sometimes we used to have one fox coming here who I knew when he turned up initially, and then he would disappear for 3 months at a time, then come back and then disappear again. And I had absolutely no idea where he was in between whiles. He could have literally been in the next county, unless you've got radio collars on them. It's, it can be quite, they do certainly move around a lot.
So what kills them?
In England, their lifespan is really short, and calves are a big mortality factor. Clever as they are and as adaptable as they are, they just don't understand transport. And particularly at this time of year, when you get young males who are just dispersing from their natal group and roving around trying to find a territory of their own, they're very vulnerable. They go into places they don't know, and they tend to get knocked down quite readily. Other factors can be disease. Scotoptic mange is a big factor in some places, and at times that can be really devastating. Over 90% of the population can die from that, but in other populations they just sort of live with it, and it comes and goes. Yeah, there's a certain number which are killed deliberately by people, legally or otherwise. Obviously, hunting with dogs has been made illegal in England. It probably still goes on to some degree. But gamekeepers, some farmers take exception to them as well.
And rabies is gone?
Yeah, rabies is long gone from England. And in fact, it's now largely gone from Western Europe. It's been a very successful program putting down vaccine in the wild. And foxes have been eating bait with this vaccine in it. And yeah, it's had a really dramatic effect at reducing the number of cases.
So what's the most surprising thing that you've discovered from all your years of studying foxes?
I think the thing that's really stood out to me is just how much of individuals they are. Each fox has a really strong personality, and they're all really different from each other. And even after 26 years of watching them, they still find ways to surprise me. I think the complexity of their social lives, considering that they hunt alone, that's a fairly recent discovery in the literature. Yeah, I'd say their social lives is the one thing that's really, really surprised me.
So, Adele, what else would you like to share with my listeners today?
I think I would like to talk a bit about how foxes they are this species which, as we talked about, evolved in a world which was largely dominated by nature. And the fact is that now the world is not that way at all. And yes, they are still found in places like eastern Poland and Yellowstone, where it's pretty wild. But they've also sort of stepped out of that, and they have managed to survive in cities and towns where a lot of other species have gone extinct. This whole topic of wildlife in the suburbs, wildlife in the city is something which is quite an active debate, because some people love having nature around and some people tend to get quite unnerved by it. But I think some of that fear is actually based upon things which aren't going to happen, misunderstandings. And some of the genuine issues which do occur could be avoided if people knew more about the animals and just were more aware about what shares the land with them. And I do feel that Western society in general, we're obviously very industrialized now, and many people have sort of lost that connection with nature. And the fact that there are wild animals like foxes that can exist close to us is actually an opportunity for people to reconnect to some degree. They still have that really strong cultural significance.
And your book is really intended to try to fill a little bit of that gap, make people have a better, accurate understanding of these fascinating creatures.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that I did while writing this was that commissioned an opinion poll company to go and examine how people felt about foxes in London and other parts of southern England. The results were really interesting. We did find that in London itself, it was a bit different to the rest of the southeast, which is more rural. Most people either like them or have no strong opinions either way, and it is only a minority of people who actually seem to have concerns about them being around. And a lot of the concerns that people raised were things that could be dealt with or just based on scenarios which were really quite unlikely to happen.
So do you have any advice for students who might want to learn more about mammal ecology?
I think the best advice really is just get out there, just see as many mammals as you can. It's important, I think, to spend as much time in your study species as you can. I've included in the book a list of potential research topics which I think students would be interested to pick up on. Some of those are more specific to the UK, some of which I think are more international. I've highlighted a few topics that perhaps aren't known that well. Fox predation on deer fawns, how they interact with badgers and that sort of thing. It can be a difficult field to get into because you normally end up doing a degree, then you have to volunteer for a while, and obviously money is, you just have to try and make do. But it is rewarding. I mean, these many species of mammals, obviously not including foxes, are struggling in this human-dominated world of ours, and finding ways in which people and wildlife can share the landscape is really important. I do feel that, I love the wilderness. I spent a lot of time in wilderness Canada and elsewhere, but amazing as the wilderness is, it's that sort of intermediate area between really urbanized areas and pure wilderness where a lot of the battlegrounds lie these days. And we've got to find ways, because that occupies such a large part of the globe now, we've got to find ways for wildlife, including mammals, to survive there.
I agree, and that's why I like the organizations that focus on cooperation rather than the you're bad, we're good approach, because that never gets anything accomplished.
Yeah, absolutely. There's some really good initiatives out there. I think there's one, so predator-friendly ranching. There's a label which is used on some Western ranchers who produce products that have committed, basically these ranchers have committed not to kill wildlife on their lands, and that is something which then the public can support by paying a small premium on those products. Foxes are not a particularly destructive species, and they are relatively easy to coexist with. Hopefully, if we can learn from them and move on to the other ones.
I was telling also my neighbor that I read in your book that they're one of the few that can actually kill an adult rat, and that certainly sounds useful.
It is very useful, and it's much appreciated. Yeah, so rats certainly have followed people around the world, and I think we need all the help we've got in that regard.
Yeah. Okay, well, I have really enjoyed our conversation, and I'm looking forward to sharing your book with my listeners. Thanks again, Adele.
Okay, thank you very much.
This episode was a slight change of pace, but I really enjoyed talking with Adele Brand about her new book, The Hidden World of the Fox. Don't forget that it's also available on audio if you prefer. I think this book would make a great gift for anyone who loves foxes or enjoys watching wildlife in unusual places. This month, I want to make a special request for email feedback. Books and Ideas is a hard podcast to promote because it doesn't fall into a clear niche. But in some ways, it's my favorite because it gives me the freedom to explore such a wide variety of topics. Why do you listen? Are you a new listener or someone who stuck by me during the show's long hiatus? I'd love to hear from you. Write to me at docartemis@gmail.com or submit voice feedback at speakpipe.com/docartemis. And of course, you can post on the Books and Ideas Facebook fan page. I'll be back next month on the 15th with a new episode of Books and Ideas. In the meantime, I hope you'll check out my other podcasts, Brain Science and Grain Rainbows. Thanks again for listening. I look forward to talking with you again very soon. Books and Ideas is copyright 2019 to Virginia Campbell, MD. You can copy this show to share it with others, but for any other uses or derivatives, please contact me at docartemis@gmail.com. Theme music for Books and Ideas is The Open Door by Beatnik Turtle. Please visit their website at beatnikturtle.com.